The antiseptic smell of death hung heavy in the corridors of Exile Station Omega-7, a place where the Thylorian Empire sent its mistakes to fade quietly into nothing. Built at the edge of known space, the station served one purpose: to let the genetically impure die with dignity, far from the crystal spires of Thylor Prime, where perfection was not just expected, but mandated by law. In the furthest corner of the Terminus Ward, where the lights dimmed automatically to conserve power. For the living, Kira lay on a biobed that had been her world for the past 3 rotations. Her scaled skin, once vibrant emerald like the healing pools of her homeworld, had faded to a sickly gray that marked the final stages of genetic collapse. The neural suppressors grafted behind her ears decades ago flickered weakly, their power. Cells dying along with their host. She had been born wrong, marked from her first breath as defective by the gene scanners that detected something the Thylorian Council called emotional instability. Where her people should have felt nothing but logical satisfaction or rational disappointment, Kira experienced what the medical texts labeled as dangerous aberrations: joy when watching starlight dance across metal, sorrow when witnessing cruelty, love for things that serve no practical function. The purification centers had declared her unfit for society before she could even form memories, shipping her to adoption facilities on distant worlds where her affliction wouldn't contaminate. Pure bloodlines. 43 years she had wandered from colony to outpost, working menial jobs, hiding her emotional responses behind carefully practiced masks of indifference. She learned to speak in monotones, to suppress the laughter that wanted to bubble up when she saw children playing, to bury the tears that threatened when she witnessed beauty. But genetics were genetics, and the Thylorian medical experts had been correct about one thing: emotional beings like her were unstable in more ways than one. The cellular degradation had started slowly, joints aching in the morning, vision blurring during long shifts. Then came the tremors, the loss of motor control, the gradual shutdown of organs that had never been designed to process the chemical storms of feeling. When the diagnosis came through official channels, the response was swift and predictable. Transportation to Omega-7, assignment to a terminal care unit, and a polite notation in her file that next of kin notification was unnecessary since she had been legally declared kinless at birth. Now she lay alone, listening to the mechanical hum of life support systems that kept her comfortable while she died. The other beds in her ward held Thylorians with similar conditions, other emotional defects who had lived their lives in exile, and would end them the same way. None of them spoke to each other, the neural suppressors and decades of conditioning making even these final moments exercises in controlled solitude. The medical staff, primarily automated drones with occasional visits from Thylorian technicians, performed their duties with the same clinical detachment that characterized everything about her species. They monitored vital signs, adjusted medication dosages, and updated terminal progression charts with the enthusiasm of machines cataloging inventory. Death here was a process to be managed, not an event to be mourned. Kira had accepted this fate months ago when the transport ship docked and she saw the stark gray walls of Omega-7 for the first time. She understood the logic of it, even appreciated the efficiency. The Empire could not waste resources on those who contributed nothing to the greater good, and emotional defects like her were by definition incapable of contributing. Better to let them expire quietly in specialized facilities than risk their condition spreading to useful members of society. But in the depths of space between sleeping and waking, when the suppressor's power dipped and her true self surfaced briefly, Kira felt something her people would have found incomprehensible. She felt lonely. Not the rational desire for social interaction that normal Thylorians experienced, but a deep aching need for connection. For someone to acknowledge that her existence had meant something, that her passing would leave some small gap in the universe. The irony wasn't lost on her that even now, facing the end, she couldn't stop feeling things that marked her as broken. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning shift change brought its usual parade of maintenance drones and the occasional Thylorian supervisor making cursory rounds. Kira had learned to recognize the patterns, the subtle differences in mechanical sounds that meant meal distribution, or waste management, or the twice-daily vital sign scans that confirmed she was still dying at the predicted rate. What she didn't expect was the sound of boots in the corridor, the distinct rhythm of organic footsteps rather than the gliding movement of hover tech. Someone was walking through the Terminus Ward, and that someone was definitely not Thylorian. Dr. Marcus Chun paused outside her door, checking the digital tablet in his hands against the room number etched into the metal frame. His dark hair was disheveled from what had clearly been a long journey, and his Human Federation medical uniform bore the wrinkles of someone who had spent too many hours in transport ships. He'd been assigned to Omega-7 as part of a cultural exchange program, a diplomatic gesture meant to foster understanding between the Empire and the Federation. What the bureaucrats hadn't mentioned in his briefing was that he'd be working in a facility designed to warehouse the dying, or that his patients would be the very individuals Thylorian society deemed unworthy of existence. Marcus stepped into the sterile environment of Omega-7 with the confidence of someone who had seen death before, but nothing in his medical training had prepared him for the calculated coldness of a Thylorian terminal facility. The walls seemed to absorb sound, creating an oppressive silence broken only by the whisper of recycled air and the distant beeping of monitoring equipment. He had requested this assignment specifically, driven by curiosity about Thylorian medical practices and a genuine desire to bridge the gap between their species through shared healing arts. The station administrator, a tall Thylorian named Supervisor Vex, had greeted him with the characteristic emotional flatness that Marcus was still learning to interpret. The tour had been brief and informative in the way that reading technical specifications might be informative, covering power distribution, waste management protocols, and patient processing procedures with the same mechanical precision. What struck Marcus most was how Vex referred to the terminal patients not as individuals, but as units, their conditions described as genetic inefficiencies being processed to conclusion. His assigned ward contained 12 beds, each occupied by a Thylorian in various stages of what the medical files euphemistically called emotional degradation syndrome. The charts made for fascinating reading from a xenobiological perspective, describing a condition where the presence of emotional responses somehow triggered cellular breakdown at the genetic level.
Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It was as if these individuals were literally dying from their ability to feel, their bodies rejecting the very chemistry that made them capable of love, joy, or sorrow. The first few patients he examined seemed almost catatonic, their neural suppressors humming at full power, their responses to his presence minimal beyond basic acknowledgement. They answered his questions in monotone voices, submitted to medical procedures with vacant compliance, and showed no interest in conversation beyond the strictly necessary. Marcus began to wonder if the suppressors were protecting them from emotional pain or simply making their final days more tolerable by numbing them to their own humanity. Then he reached room 7, where his tablet indicated a patient designated as Kira, terminal emotional defect, 43 cycles old, no registered kin, estimated expiration within 10 rotations. The clinical language couldn't quite mask what Marcus recognized as a death sentence for the crime of being born different. When he entered her room, Kira was awake, her large eyes tracking his movement with an alertness that surprised him. Unlike the others, she seemed to be studying him as much as he was observing her, taking in details of his uniform, his equipment, his obviously non-Thylorian features. Her skin had the gray pallor he'd seen in the other patients, but something and her expression suggested a mind still fully engaged with the world around her. Marcus introduced himself according to the protocols he'd been given, identifying his species, his medical credentials, and his purpose on the station. Standard procedure dictated a brief physical examination, followed by medication adjustment and chart notation. He had performed this routine 11 times already that morning, each interaction following the same pattern of professional distance and clinical efficiency. But when Kira responded to his greeting, something in her voice caught his attention. Beneath the carefully controlled tone, he heard what sounded almost like curiosity, a subtle inflection that suggested genuine interest in his presence, rather than mere compliance with medical authority. Her questions about his journey to the station, his previous experience with Thylorian physiology, and his impressions of the facility went beyond the perfunctory responses he'd received from others. As Marcus conducted his examination, checking her vital signs and reviewing the progression of her condition, he found himself departing from the standard script. Where previous patients had submitted to his procedures in silence, Kira seemed almost eager to engage, asking about the differences between human and Thylorian medical practices, expressing fascination with his diagnostic equipment, and offering observations about her own symptoms that went well beyond basic patient cooperation. Her medical file painted a picture of steady decline, organs failing in sequence as her genetic structure continued to break down under the stress of emotional capacity. The projections were grimly precise, predicting complete system failure within days rather than weeks. Yet the individual lying before him showed none of the passive resignation he expected from someone facing imminent death. If anything, she seemed more alive, more present, than any of the other patients he'd encountered. During their conversation, Marcus noticed that her neural suppressors were functioning at reduced capacity, their power cells clearly near exhaustion. Standard protocol would have been to replace them immediately, ensuring maximum comfort during her final days by minimizing any emotional distress. But something made him hesitate, tablet in hand, staring at the requisition form for new suppressor units. The difference in Kira's demeanor compared to the others suddenly made sense. While her fellow patients existed in a numbed state of pharmaceutical tranquility, she was experiencing the full spectrum of her emotional capacity as her suppressors failed. She was facing death not as a sedated medical statistic, but as a conscious being fully aware of what she was losing. Marcus found himself wondering what kind of person she might have been if born into a society that valued emotional diversity instead of viewing it as a genetic defect. Her intelligence was obvious, her curiosity infectious, her ability to find interest in new experiences remarkable for someone supposedly dying from the very traits that made her engaging. The clinical files describe her condition as a pathological inability to regulate emotional responses. But Marcus saw something entirely different, an individual whose capacity for feeling had been criminalized by a culture that feared what it couldn't understand. When their session ended and Marcus prepared to move on to his remaining patients, Kira thanked him for taking time to actually talk with her rather than simply processing her like a medical specimen. The gratitude in her voice carried a weight that stayed with him as he completed his rounds, each subsequent patient seeming more hollow by comparison, their suppressed personalities pale shadows of what they might have been. That evening, as Marcus reviewed his notes in the small quarters assigned to him, he found himself returning repeatedly to Kira's file, studying the progression charts and treatment protocols with growing unease. The medical science was sound, the facility procedures efficient, and the overall system designed to handle terminal cases with minimal resource expenditure. Yet something fundamental felt wrong about a society that condemned its own people to solitary death simply for possessing the capacity to care about their own existence. Marcus found sleep elusive that first night aboard Omega-7, his mind churning with questions that his medical training hadn't prepared him to answer. The sterile efficiency of the facility felt oppressive in the artificial darkness, every corridor designed to minimize human contact, every system optimized for processing rather than healing. He kept thinking about Kira's eyes, the way they had tracked his movements with an intelligence that seemed almost desperate to connect with another thinking being. By the third day of his rotation, Marcus had established a routine that deviated significantly from standard protocol. While his Thylorian colleagues completed their patient rounds with mechanical precision, spending perhaps 5 minutes per individual to verify medication schedules and update terminal progression charts, Marcus found himself lingering in room 7 far longer than medical necessity required. Kira's neural suppressors continued to deteriorate, and with them, her ability to maintain the emotional blankness that Thylorian society demanded. Marcus watched this transformation with growing fascination and concern, witnessing what he could only describe as a personality emerging from decades of enforced numbness. She began to ask questions that went beyond polite medical inquiry, wanting to know about his homeworld, his family, the choices that had led him to pursue xenomedicine among the stars. Her curiosity about human culture proved infectious. Marcus found himself describing Earth's seasons, the way autumn leaves changed color before falling, the sound of rain on windows during storm seasons. Simple concepts that he had taken for granted became profound when filtered through the perspective of someone who had never experienced weather, never seen a natural sky, never witnessed the organic chaos of a world shaped by geological time, rather than architectural planning. In return, Kira began sharing fragments of her own story, pieces of a life lived in the shadows of a society that viewed her existence as an ongoing mistake. She described growing up in sterile adoption facilities where emotional responses were monitored and documented as symptoms rather than celebrated as human experiences. She told him about jobs on mining stations and cargo freighters, always temporary positions because her condition made long-term employment impossible when supervisors noticed her tendency to form attachments to co-workers or express genuine enthusiasm for her work. Marcus learned that Kira had been exceptionally gifted in what Thylorians called pattern analysis, possessing an intuitive understanding of complex systems that her employers found valuable despite her genetic defects. She had helped design more efficient cargo loading protocols, identified structural weaknesses in station architecture before they became critical failures, and even contributed to improvements in life support systems that had saved lives during emergency situations. Yet none of these contributions had earned her acceptance in Thylorian society, merely temporary tolerance until her emotional instability became too inconvenient to overlook. The irony struck Marcus as particularly cruel. Kira's capacity for emotional connection, the very trait that had marked her for exile, seemed directly linked to her ability to understand and improve the systems that kept other people alive. Her empathy allowed her to anticipate failure points that purely logical analysis might miss, to consider variables that didn't appear in standard engineering equations. The Empire had spent decades trying to suppress the very quality that made her most valuable. As her suppressors continued to fail, Kira began experiencing the full range of emotions that had been artificially dampened since childhood. Marcus watched her marvel at sensations that healthy humans took for granted, seeing wonder in her face as she described, feeling actual sadness about her approaching death rather than mere acceptance of an inevitable biological process. She talked about experiencing gratitude for their conversations, not as a social obligation, but as genuine appreciation for moments of connection that made her remaining time meaningful. The transformation wasn't always pleasant to witness. Decades of suppressed grief began surfacing as Kira confronted the reality of a life spent hiding fundamental aspects of her identity. She wept for opportunities never taken, relationships never formed, experiences never shared because emotional expression had been too dangerous. Marcus found himself staying past his scheduled shifts, sitting beside her bed as she processed feelings that most beings work through gradually over lifetimes, compressed now into the final days of her existence. Her questions about human society revealed the depth of her isolation from anything resembling normal social interaction. She wanted to know about friendships that lasted decades, about romantic love that inspired people to make sacrificial choices, about family bonds that transcended biological necessity. Concepts that Marcus had learned to take for granted became precious gifts as he shared them with someone encountering them for the first time. Marcus began bringing small items from his personal quarters to make their conversations more tangible. A photo of his sister's wedding helped him explain celebration and joy. A smooth stone from a riverbank on Earth became a touchstone for discussing natural beauty and the pleasure of experiencing environments shaped by time rather than engineering. A dried flower pressed between the pages of a book illustrated the bittersweet nature of preserving moments that couldn't last forever. Kira's response to these simple objects revealed the poverty of experience that Thylorian society had imposed on its emotional citizens. She had never seen flowers, never touched anything shaped by geological processes, never witnessed the spontaneous celebration that accompanied important life events. Her world had been constructed entirely of artificial materials, designed spaces, and regulated interactions. Even her food had been processed nutrition rather than cuisine, her sleeping quarters assigned rather than chosen, her daily activities scheduled by external authority rather than personal preference. Yet despite this deprivation, or perhaps because of it, Kira approached each new concept with an enthusiasm that reminded Marcus why he had chosen medicine in the first place. Her hunger for understanding, her genuine delight in learning about experiences beyond her reach, her ability to find meaning in the smallest gestures of connection, made their daily conversations the highlight of his assignment. The other patients in the ward began to notice the extended time Marcus spent in room 7, though their suppressed emotional states prevented them from expressing curiosity or concern about the deviation from standard protocol. The shift supervisor, a rigid Thylorian named Administrator Scion, materialized in the corridor outside room 7 during Marcus's 5th day on the station. Unlike the medical drones that glided silently through their routines, Scion moved with the deliberate precision of someone accustomed to absolute authority over their domain. The administrator's pale blue skin seemed to absorb the fluorescent lighting, creating an almost spectral appearance that matched the coldness in their voice. Marcus emerged from Kira's room to find Scion reviewing data streams on a floating holographic display, patient files scrolling past in neat columns of text and numerical progressions. The administrator acknowledged his presence with a minimal nod, their attention seemingly focused on the statistical summaries rather than any individual case details. The conversation that followed felt more like an interrogation than a routine check-in. Scion inquired about Marcus's adaptation to station protocols, his assessment of the terminal care procedures, and his professional opinion regarding the efficiency of current treatment methodologies. Standard questions delivered in the flat, emotionless tone that characterized all official Thylorian communication. But beneath the clinical inquiry, Marcus detected something else. Scion's questions grew increasingly specific about time allocation per patient, the necessity of extended consultation periods, and the optimal balance between thorough care and resource management. The administrator seemed particularly interested in Marcus's observations about patient responsiveness to treatment and whether certain individuals required additional monitoring due to unusual behavioral patterns. Marcus chose his words carefully, emphasizing his commitment to thorough medical documentation and his appreciation for the station's systematic approach to terminal care. He described his interactions with patients in terms of diagnostic necessity and cultural adaptation, framing his extended conversations as essential research into human Thylorian medical cooperation. The explanation seemed to satisfy Scion's immediate concerns, though Marcus noticed the administrator making additional notations on their personal datapad. After Scion departed, Marcus returned to find Kira noticeably agitated, her hands trembling as she gripped the bed railings. She had overheard portions of the conversation through the thin walls, enough to understand that his presence in her room was being questioned. The fear in her eyes wasn't for herself, but for him, concerned that their friendship might jeopardize his position or career prospects. This moment of selfless worry, coming from someone facing imminent death, crystallized something fundamental for Marcus about the profound injustice of Thylorian society. Here was an individual capable of empathy, even in extremis, someone whose first instinct was to protect others from consequences of their own choices. Yet this same capacity for caring had marked her as genetically defective, worthy only of exile and abandonment. Kira's physical condition continued, deteriorating according to the precise timeline predicted by Thylorian medical science. Her skin grew more translucent with each passing day, revealing the intricate network of veins beneath as her circulatory system struggled to maintain basic functions. Her breathing became labored, requiring supplemental oxygen that hissed softly through nasal cannulas. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by muscle spasms and neurological misfires, as her nervous system began its systematic shutdown. Yet paradoxically, as her body failed, her emotional awareness seemed to intensify. The dying suppressors allowed feelings to surface with unprecedented clarity, as if decades of accumulated experience were demanding acknowledgement before time ran out. She spoke of suddenly understanding why certain colors had always attracted her attention, why specific musical patterns had resonated in ways she couldn't previously explain, why moments of unexpected kindness from strangers had lingered in her memory for years. Marcus began documenting these observations in his personal notes, carefully separate from the official medical records that Scion and other administrators would review. He recorded Kira's descriptions of synesthetic experiences where emotions triggered visual phenomena, her growing ability to detect subtle mood changes in the medical staff despite their emotional training, and her increasingly sophisticated understanding of interpersonal dynamics that had been invisible to her under suppression. Their conversations evolved beyond simple cultural exchange into something approaching philosophical exploration. Kira possessed a unique perspective on consciousness and identity, having experienced both the numbed existence that Thylorian society considered normal and the chaotic richness of unfiltered emotional reality. She could articulate the difference between logical satisfaction and genuine joy, between rational assessment and heartfelt appreciation, between duty-based cooperation and freely chosen friendship. Her insights about the nature of authentic relationship challenged Marcus's own assumptions about connection and intimacy. She described how the constant need to hide her true responses had created layers of performance and concealment that made genuine interaction nearly impossible. Even now, dying among strangers, she was experiencing her first taste of unconditional acceptance from another conscious being. Marcus found himself sharing details about his own life that he rarely discussed with anyone, let alone patients. He told her about the loneliness of deep space assignments, the professional satisfaction that never quite filled the emotional void left by years of isolation, the gradual realization that technical competence couldn't substitute for meaningful human connection. In Kira's presence, surrounded by the clinical sterility of a death facility, he was rediscovering his own capacity for authentic relationship. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that their deepest friendship was forming under circumstances that guaranteed its brief duration. Kira joked that perhaps this intensity was possible precisely because there were no future complications to consider, no long-term expectations to navigate, no practical concerns beyond the present moment. For the first time in her life, she could be completely honest about her thoughts and feelings without fear of consequences. Marcus began staying after his official shifts ended, bringing meals to share in her room and extending their conversations. Late into the station's artificial night cycle, he introduced her to human games that could be played with simple materials, taught her songs that didn't require instruments, shared stories from literature and history that illustrated the full spectrum of human experience. Kira absorbed these glimpses of a larger universe with desperate hunger, as if trying to compress a lifetime of missed experiences into her remaining days. Kira's final hours arrived with the quiet inevitability that Thylorian medical science had predicted, her body surrendering to genetic collapse as her last neural suppressor finally died completely. Marcus remained at her bedside, despite Administrator Scion's pointed suggestions that his presence served no medical purpose, his hand resting gently on hers as her breathing grew shallow and irregular. For the first time in her 43 years, Kira experienced death without the numbing barrier of artificial emotional control. She could feel genuine fear about the unknown, authentic gratitude for Marcus's friendship, and real sorrow about leaving behind the connection she had discovered. Too late. Yet alongside these difficult emotions came something unexpected: peace. Not the hollow tranquility of suppressed feelings, but the deep satisfaction of having finally lived authentically, even if only for a few precious days. Marcus spoke quietly to her as consciousness faded, sharing memories of their conversations and promising that her story wouldn't end with her death. He told her about the detailed notes he had compiled, documenting her insights about emotion and identity, her observations about the cost of suppressing fundamental aspects of consciousness. Her experience would contribute to his research, potentially helping other beings trapped in similar circumstances. When Kira's vital signs finally flatlined, Marcus sat in silence for a long time, holding the hand of someone who had taught him more about humanity than years of medical training. Administrator Scion eventually appeared to initiate standard disposal protocols, but found Marcus quietly preparing a written report that would challenge everything Thylorian society believed about emotional defects. Months later, Marcus is published. Research sparked debates across multiple star systems about the ethics of genetic purity and the true nature of consciousness. Kira's story, told through the eyes of a human doctor who had witnessed her transformation, began changing minds and opening hearts throughout the galaxy. She had been abandoned at birth and cast out at death, but in those final days, a human had stayed by her side and ensured her legacy would endure. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.